Rev up your engines! Today we got a car with a common problem. It's running rich. It's a Lexus IS 250 with like 150,000 miles on it. He noticed on the scan tool data that it's sometimes subtracting as much as 20% fuel. Cars, as they age, will often run either rich or lean. There's a billion reasons that can do it. First thing you want to do is start with the basics. Now look at all this plastic nonsense. We got to get all that crap off. Get that out of the way. Now, being a mechanic, this isn't for pulling teeth. I guess you could use it for that. You can snap them all up by sticking them in the hole and pulling them out. Makes it a lot easier. Now, first thing we do is look at the air filter. If it's clogged, you won't get enough air. Curse all this plastic nonsense. There. Get that out of the way. It's still hard to get to. Oh, buttheads that design these things. Oh, with a giant screwdriver. There. Now we got it off. And guess what? It popped back on. There. I'll hold it off with one hand. There we go. Now, he wasn't ignorant. This is clean. You won't believe the amount of times I get cars that are running rich. The air filter's clogged. Rich means you have too much fuel or not enough air. Well, in this case, it's got plenty of air, so it's not that. Sometimes a long screwdriver comes in really handy. Now, next, we're going to check to see if there's any kind of vacuum leaks, any strange noises, so we'll start it up. Now, I noticed one thing. You can see this is louder than the average Lexus, by far. Now, this is Tennessee, there's no laws, so he had a muffler delete done. That's why it's louder. That delete may be part of the problem because you're changing the back pressure of the exhaust system. And often, when you delete them, they will run slightly richer. Now, first we're gonna look for anything obvious under here. Yeah, for a Lexus, the engine's a little bit noisy, but with that kind of mileage, the lifters are gonna make a little bit of noise. Take, for example, my wife's Lexus. It's a lot older, but it's only got like 80,000 miles on it. It doesn't make any noise at all. This has got almost twice that mileage. And as we look around, there's nothing really sucking air. Everything's plugged in, so with a scan tool. See what kind of data's coming out of this thing. Go with an auto scan, and we will do a full scan of it. Here we go. Well, while I'm sitting here waiting, hey, the heated seat still works good. It's cold outside, but my butt is warm. Got codes that we're not particularly interested in, the seats and everything. Four-wheel drive, the TPMS system. You know, these are generally communication codes. Let's see, the steering. Let's see what it says about the steering. What it doesn't like. We'll look at the trouble code. Lost communication with anti-lock system control module. Now, that stuff happens all the time. Sometime in the history of this vehicle, somebody probably changed the battery. The battery was weak, lost communication, and nobody ever reset it. I see that so many times when I get in these used cars that now what I do is, since we're checking everything out, we just go backwards, and what we'll do is we'll just clear the codes because none of them have to do with it running rich. We'll get rid of all that. Running of the vehicle, that's all green. So now we're going to look at the raw data. There's no codes, but you already know that. So you read the trouble codes, it'll say there aren't any. None. What we want to look is live data. And as you can see here, there's 235 bits of raw data. So, here we go. He's worried about it running rich some. So, we shall go see if anything is odd here. It's all black, so that's good so far. Now, here we go. And this is the interesting part. If you look at the short term for bank 1, it's minus 0.8. Now it's 0. That's perfect. So short term, it's running perfectly fine. Yet, the long term is minus 31%. Bank 2 is pretty much the same. The short term is 0, right? And the long term is minus 22.7. For some reason, in the long run, it is giving it too much fuel and it's got to subtract fuel. So now we're going to try something. We're going to rev it up. Now you can see the long term is normalizing more. It's not 30, it's 11. This one's 14. And the short term fuel is actually adding fuel. Now we'll let it go. Here's the short term. See, now that it's equalizing, there it went to 0. You take a while there. So now it's idle and it's equalized at 0. Now, truthfully, from my experience of these cars, it's because the mufflers are gone. It's confused. The computer system, you saw it started just idling. It was perfect. Short term was almost perfect. At times, both were 0, which is pretty good for a car that's got 152,000 miles on it. But since there's no back pressure, because the mufflers are gone, what's going to happen is the catalytic converters, the air is going to flow through them a little bit too fast. It confuses the readings of the air-fuel ratio monitors. Now, people, you often know them as oxygen sensors. It works the same way, but these are fancier, they're more efficient, but they need a certain amount of time. And if the gas is flowing through too fast, it confuses the system. So now we're going to take it a road test. He's going to drive, and I'm going to watch the data. Now we're going down the road, and we'll start watching it. And you can see as we're going, the long-term fuel trim is not that bad now. We're going to take on my little drag strip down here a couple miles, and we'll see what happens going 50 miles an hour. And that'll give us a good analysis of what's happening. As you're driving, accelerating, decelerating, these figures are going to go all over the place anyway. The only thing we care about is how is it actually doing while you're going down the road at a steady pace. Now, as you can see, the car runs perfectly fine. It's loud because he took the mufflers off, but it's not hesitating. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go a straight 45 miles an hour for a couple of miles, and we'll watch the data. The long-term fuel trim here is -7, -4. This one, -2, -4. At a steady pace, it's running relatively normal. He was worried because he saw the data when he was just sitting there idling. Now, a good thing is we put it on cruise control. When you have it on cruise control, then you'll be able to get really stable readings. And we can see here it's only subtracting 2.4, and here it's actually minus. Now we're going up a hill, and that confuses the whole thing. So we'll graph it now. I see that they're following each other, which is a good thing, meaning you don't have a problem on one side versus the other. Let's say you had a bad fuel injector. The side that had the bad fuel injector, of course, would be the one that's spraying too much fuel, and one side would be different than the other, but they both pretty much follow each other. So, runs fine. It's just giving him skewed data when he's at an idle because the system is confused. It doesn't have the back pressure of the muffler, so the readings of the oxygen sensors, it's just flowing through it so differently when you're idling or accelerating and decelerating. But of course, when you're going at a steady speed, then the flow is exactly the same. The sensors can equilibrate to that. They're confused as the RPMs go up and down, but at a steady speed, the data is good, showing there's really absolutely nothing wrong with the car other than the mufflers were taken off. Now, as you can hear as it accelerates, it doesn't sound like a Lexus because they are quiet vehicles, but it runs like a Lexus. Now, I find this interesting because I've seen this before on these Lexuses. People taking the mufflers off, they do the same thing. But to the plus side of Lexus, their software is so good that it can counteract the effect of not having the mufflers on. The vehicles still run perfectly fine. But if you look at the data, you're like, oh, it's running so rich, it's going to destroy my car. Well, it actually isn't. And I do kind of like the sound. Now, most people with Lexuses want it quiet, but this is an IS250. It sounds cooler, and this is Tennessee. There's no laws for it. So, in this case, he doesn't have to do anything unless he wants the long term to be normal. Then he'd have to put the mufflers back on and be quiet. So in this case, the short-term fuel trim was fine the whole time. It was the long-term fuel trim that's an average that was off because it's getting confused with the change in flow, but it's able to equilibrate it even without the mufflers, that it runs fine. Now, the owner was worried that he was getting oil dilution. So we'll pull out the dipstick. And what does it smell like? It smells like oil. Now, if you really got oil dilution, of course, when you did, the dipstick would show more and more oil in it. And it doesn't. It's on the line where it's supposed to be, right? If you do have a car that you smell a bunch of gasoline and your level of oil is going up and you are not adding oil, that's the only thing that can do it, aside from a blowing head gasket, but that would be water. Then it wouldn't look like oil. It would look like a foamy milkshake, which it doesn't. So, in this case, sometimes a little knowledge is a bad thing, because he was really worried that the long-term fuel trim, that it was showing it was running super rich and it was subtracting a ton of fuel, was just more a software anomaly, readjusting itself because the mufflers aren't there. It adjusted perfectly, but obviously it's doing more of an adjustment to add fuel than it is to subtract fuel. Some of the times when he was accelerating, I could see it was actually long-term adding fuel instead of subtracting fuel. It wasn't staying in the catalytic converter long enough to get a correct reading. It was blowing itself out. But once it stayed at 1 RPM, going 50 miles an hour, 45, 50 miles an hour with cruise control on, it stabilized. And since it stabilized then, you know, well, there's really nothing wrong with the vehicle other than the mufflers aren't there, and it gets confused, so it's radically going up and down, and the long-term fuel looks bad, but the short-term fuel that is what's running the car, when you drive down the road, it's the short-term fuel trim that makes the car run right, and that was pretty much spot on. It would go a little up, a little down, like they normally do. They'll go a little bit rich, a little bit lean, sometimes perfectly at 0. Once going at a steady speed, it ran perfectly fine. So he really doesn't have to do anything other than, if he wants to be a fanatic, he'd have to put the mufflers back on, and then this long-term fuel trim would be closer to 0 than it is. But it's not hurting anything. He thought maybe he had a bad spark plug or a bad fuel injector. Well, if he did, of course, that cylinder being that bad, being off 20%, and that other one was 30-something%, it would show misfires on those particular cylinders. It's a V6, and if it was number 2, it would show that on number 2, and it showed no misfires whatsoever, which I could tell that just driving around, and it runs perfectly fine. The lesson to be learned here is, if you want perfection, don't take the mufflers off. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.